In the late 19th century, a wave of immigrants arrived in the United States seeking a better future in the land of opportunity. Among them was a young boy born in Italy, who, like many others, came from humble beginnings. Life in his homeland had been harsh. Poverty, limited opportunities, and social inequality made survival a daily struggle. The promise of America, with its streets supposedly paved with gold, was too tempting to resist. When he arrived in the United States, he found that reality was far different from the dream. Settling in Chicago, he was quickly exposed to the harsh conditions that many immigrants faced. Instead of opportunity, he encountered discrimination, extreme poverty, and a lack of employment options. Many newcomers were forced into low-paying, back-breaking labor just to survive. However, he was not content with merely scraping by. He had ambition, and he was willing to do whatever it took to rise above his circumstances. In his early years, he worked a variety of jobs, including as a street sweeper and a laborer. But he quickly realized that hard work alone would not lead to wealth or power. The streets of Chicago were ruled not by honest men, but by those who understood the power of influence, money, and control. The city's underworld was growing, and opportunities for those willing to bend the rules were abundant. It was in this environment that he learned the rules of survival, rules that would shape his future in ways he could not yet imagine. It wasn't long before he found himself drawn into the criminal world. Like many young men struggling to make ends meet, he started with small-time hustles, running errands for local criminals, engaging in petty theft, and eventually participating in protection rackets. He was a natural at navigating the underbelly of the city, quickly gaining a reputation for being both resourceful and ruthless when needed. Unlike many of his peers who remained small-time criminals, he had bigger ambitions. He understood that power was built on alliances, and he began forming connections with key figures in Chicago's growing underworld. He learned how to manipulate the system, how to bribe officials, and most importantly, how to make himself indispensable to those in power. Over time, his influence expanded. He became a key player in organized crime, slowly building what would become one of the most powerful crime syndicates in the city. He had transformed from an impoverished immigrant boy into a figure who would soon command both fear and respect. His rise was just beginning, but the foundation had been laid, a foundation built on ambition, strategy, and a willingness to do whatever it took to succeed. The streets of Chicago in the early 1900s were a breeding ground for crime, especially for those who came from impoverished backgrounds. For many immigrants, the American dream was not as easily attainable as they had hoped. Jobs were scarce, wages were low, and discrimination made it even harder to climb the social ladder. The city's underworld, however, offered a different kind of opportunity, one that did not require formal education, connections, or waiting years for success. It was a world where power could be seized by those who were bold enough to take it. He started, as many young men did, by doing small, illegal jobs that put a little extra money in his pocket. At first, it was petty theft, pickpocketing, and running errands for more established criminals. These were low-risk tasks but provided a crucial introduction to the way crime operated in Chicago. He learned who the key players were, how money moved, and most importantly, how loyalty and fear dictated survival in the criminal underworld. His early jobs put him in contact with powerful figures in the city's organized crime scene. He became involved in protection rackets, where local businesses were forced to pay for protection from violence, often the very violence that the same criminals would threaten them with. These operations were lucrative, and they also gave him a reputation for being both persuasive and, when necessary, ruthless. Unlike many small-time criminals who were content with making a quick dollar, he had a mind for business. He recognized that crime, like any other industry, required organization, leadership, and strategy. He was not interested in being just another street thug. He wanted control. His natural charisma and ability to command respect allowed him to rise quickly through the ranks. He understood how to use both fear and favor to his advantage, rewarding loyalty handsomely while dealing with betrayal swiftly and without mercy. As his influence grew, so did the scale of his operations. He expanded beyond simple extortion and moved into larger, more profitable crimes. He became involved in illegal gambling operations, which were in high demand among Chicago's working class. Betting on horse races, card games, and underground casinos brought in enormous amounts of money, and he ensured that a portion of every wager found its way into his pocket. But it was not just his criminal activities that set him apart. It was his ability to manipulate the system. He knew that real power came from more than just brute force. It required connections in high places. He began forming relationships with politicians, law enforcement officers, and judges, ensuring that his operations could run smoothly with minimal interference. Bribes were handed out generously, and in return, his business was allowed to flourish. Through a combination of street smarts, ambition, and a willingness to do whatever it took, he transformed himself from a petty criminal into a major player in Chicago's underworld. But as his power grew, so did the dangers that came with it. The more wealth and influence he accumulated, the more enemies he made, both within the criminal world and outside of it. By the early 1900s, the criminal underworld in Chicago was thriving, and he had positioned himself at the center of it all. What had begun as small-time hustling had evolved into something much larger, an organized and highly profitable criminal empire that extended across the city. His rise to power was not a matter of luck. It was the result of careful planning, strategic alliances, and an unrelenting drive for control. At the heart of his operations were gambling, prostitution, and extortion, three industries that, when managed correctly, generated immense wealth. He understood that in a rapidly growing city like Chicago, there would always be a demand for vices. People wanted entertainment, pleasure, and escape, and he was more than willing to provide it, for a price. One of his greatest strengths was his ability to organize crime in a way that made it run like a business. Unlike the chaotic, violent operations of small-time street gangs, his empire was structured, disciplined, and incredibly efficient. He put systems in place to ensure that money flowed smoothly, and he built a network of loyal enforcers who kept his interests protected. Anyone who tried to operate outside his control was swiftly dealt with, ensuring that his dominance remained unchallenged. His gambling operations were among the most profitable in the city. He controlled underground casinos, betting parlors, and even had influence over legal establishments where games of chance were played. His reach extended into the highest levels of society, with wealthy businessmen and politicians frequenting his establishments. These weren't just places to gamble. They were exclusive social clubs where the powerful met, deals were made, and influence was exchanged. However, it was his control over prostitution that truly cemented his power. During this period, red light districts were a major part of Chicago's nightlife, and he ensured that every brothel and illicit establishment operated under his authority. He provided protection for these businesses, keeping both law enforcement and rival criminals at bay, so long as they paid their dues. His grip on the industry was so strong that he essentially ran a citywide monopoly, controlling every aspect of the trade from recruitment to management. Extortion was another key pillar of his empire. Businesses across Chicago knew that they had to pay for protection. Refusing to comply meant facing consequences. It wasn't just small businesses that were targeted. Even large companies and wealthy individuals found themselves under his influence. His ability to enforce his demands without immediate consequences was due in large part to his deep ties with law enforcement and political figures. He had built relationships with those in power, ensuring that any legal trouble could be handled with a well-placed bribe or a quiet conversation behind closed doors. What set him apart from other criminals was his ability to blend into high society. He didn't just operate in the shadows, he flaunted his success openly. He owned elegant restaurants, luxurious properties, and dressed like a true businessman. His establishments were known for their grandeur, attracting both the elite and the underworld alike. He had built a persona that made him untouchable, at least for a time. His dominance in Chicago was unquestionable. Every major illegal operation in the city had his name attached to it in some way. But power in the criminal world is never secure for long. As he continued to expand his empire, he also attracted the attention of those who wanted to take it from him. His refusal to evolve with the changing times would ultimately prove to be his greatest weakness point. One of the most critical factors in his rise to power was his ability to forge strong relationships with those in authority. Unlike many criminals who operated in secrecy, fearing the law, he understood that true success in the underworld required more than just muscle. It required influence. He didn't just bribe law enforcement. He built an entire network of politicians, police officers, and city officials who were either loyal to him or too afraid to oppose him. Chicago in the early 20th century was a city riddled with corruption. Political machines controlled elections. The police force was filled with officers who could be bought, and judges often turned a blind eye to illegal activities for the right price. This environment was perfect for someone who knew how to manipulate the system. He made sure that key figures in local government were well taken care of, whether through bribes, favors, or political contributions. At the heart of his political influence was his deep involvement with local politicians, particularly those who ran the city's democratic political machine. These politicians needed money and voter support, both of which he could provide. In return, they ensured that his businesses were left alone. If a police officer or government official ever posed a threat to his operations, it wasn't difficult to have them reassigned, removed, or paid off. His connections extended beyond city officials. He had influence over judges and prosecutors, ensuring that legal cases against him or his associates were either dismissed or reduced in severity. Arrests were rare, and when they did happen, they rarely led to convictions. Even if someone in his organization was caught committing a crime, they would often walk free due to lack of evidence, or witness testimonies mysteriously disappearing. Perhaps one of the most effective ways he secured political loyalty was through financial support. Politicians running for office needed funding for campaigns, and he was more than willing to provide it, so long as they understood that their success came with obligations. By controlling the flow of money in Chicago's political scene, he ensured that those in power were indebted to him. They might not have openly supported his criminal activities, but they certainly weren't going to interfere with them. His political influence also allowed him to expand his operations with minimal resistance. When he wanted to open a new gambling den or brothel, zoning laws and business restrictions were easily overlooked. If a rival tried to enter his territory, city officials found convenient legal reasons to shut them down. This gave him an unparalleled level of control over Chicago's underworld, as his competitors were not only fighting against his gang but also against a legal system that was tilted in his favor. Even law enforcement agencies that were supposed to uphold justice found themselves entangled in his web of corruption. Many police officers were on his payroll, either through direct payments or promises of future promotions. If a business refused to comply with his demands, it wasn't uncommon for police officers under his control to raid the establishment and shut it down under false pretenses. On the other hand, if one of his illegal operations was at risk of being exposed, his connections ensured that investigations went nowhere. He also had a talent for making himself appear as a legitimate businessman to the public. While many knew of his criminal empire, his open connections with city leaders gave him an air of respectability. He hosted lavish events attended by politicians, businessmen, and even law enforcement officials. These social gatherings weren't just for entertainment. They were strategic moves that reinforced his power and influence. By publicly associating with respected figures, he created a protective shield around himself, making it difficult for authorities to take action against him without exposing their own involvement. His deep-rooted political connections made him one of the most untouchable figures in Chicago. He had turned corruption into an asset, ensuring that his empire could operate without fear of government interference. However, power built on corruption is never permanent. As new forces emerged and the landscape of crime changed, his once loyal allies began to shift their priorities, setting the stage for the challenges that would eventually threaten his control. As his power grew, so did his ambitions. He was no longer just a street-level criminal running small rackets. He was a businessman, an entrepreneur of the underworld, and he saw Chicago as a city filled with opportunities. Every vice had a market, and he was determined to monopolize them all. His empire was built on three main industries: gambling, prostitution, and extortion. Each of these businesses was carefully structured, ensuring maximum profit with minimal interference from law enforcement. He ran them with the efficiency of a legitimate corporation, appointing trusted lieutenants to oversee different aspects of the operation. These men reported directly to him, ensuring that he maintained full control over every dollar that flowed through his empire. Gambling was one of his most profitable ventures. Chicago's working class, businessmen, and even politicians were all eager to test their luck, and he provided the perfect venues for them. He established underground casinos where high-stakes card games and dice games took place nightly. Horse racing was another lucrative business. He controlled betting parlors where wagers were placed on races, often with rigged outcomes that ensured his profits. Even in legal gambling establishments, he had men on the inside, making sure that a percentage of all winnings went into his pocket. His gambling operations weren't just about money, they were about influence. The people who frequented his establishments included some of the most powerful figures in the city. Businessmen, city officials, and even police officers enjoyed the entertainment he provided. This gave him leverage. Anyone who owed him money or had a secret to hide became another pawn in his growing network of control. Prostitution was another pillar of his empire. He saw the growing demand for brothels and took advantage of it, creating an organized system that turned Chicago's red light districts into a gold mine. Unlike the chaotic, unregulated brothels that had existed before, his operations were tightly controlled. He ensured that his establishments provided security for both workers and clients, making them the most desirable locations in the city. The result was a monopoly over the industry. No brothel in Chicago could operate without his approval, and anyone who tried to defy him quickly found themselves out of business. Beyond these traditional rackets, he also expanded into other lucrative areas. He controlled speakeasies where alcohol flowed freely, despite prohibition looming on the horizon. Even before bootlegging became a dominant criminal enterprise, he saw the potential for profit in illegal liquor sales. His high-end restaurants and nightclubs were not just places to dine. They were hubs of entertainment where alcohol was discreetly served to those who could afford it. Extortion remained one of his most effective tools for expanding his empire. He knew that fear was often more powerful than money. Businesses across the city paid him protection fees, ensuring that their establishments wouldn't be targeted by vandals or rival criminals. Those who refused found themselves dealing with sudden fires, stolen goods, or violent attacks that left them no choice but to comply. This method of control extended beyond small businesses. Wealthy property owners, factory managers, and even theater owners found themselves under his thumb. One of his most strategic moves was his control over unions and labor forces. He understood that Chicago's industries relied on organized labor, and by gaining influence over unions, he could dictate the terms of business in the city. If a company refused to cooperate with him, their workers might suddenly go on strike. If a competitor tried to rise, their supply lines could be mysteriously delayed. This gave him an extraordinary level of power, making him a behind-the-scenes force in Chicago's economy. With his empire growing at an unprecedented rate, he began investing in more legitimate businesses as well. He purchased high-end restaurants, hotels, and real estate properties, using them as both fronts for illegal activities and ways to launder money. His wealth allowed him to live a life of luxury, and he made sure that his public image reflected that of a successful businessman rather than a crime lord. He was frequently seen at lavish social gatherings, rubbing shoulders with Chicago's elite, further cementing his influence. But with rapid expansion came new challenges. The bigger his empire grew, the harder it became to control. New players entered the scene, eager to carve out their own piece of Chicago's underworld. As Prohibition loomed, a new criminal market was emerging, one that some of his closest associates saw as the future of organized crime. However, he was reluctant to embrace this change, a decision that would lead to tension within his ranks. As his empire expanded, so did the number of enemies he made. In the world of organized crime, power was never secure for long. There were always new challengers, ambitious men who wanted a piece of the lucrative underworld he controlled. While he had built a powerful network of political connections and law enforcement allies, his growing dominance made him a target, not just for rival criminals, but also for those within his own organization who sought greater power. One of his earliest challenges came from independent criminal factions that refused to submit to his authority. Chicago was home to various ethnic gangs, each vying for control of different illegal enterprises. The Irish, the Jews, and other Italian gangs all had their own operations, and while some preferred to cooperate, others saw him as an obstacle to their own success. Turf wars were inevitable. The streets of Chicago became battlegrounds where disputes were settled with violence. Businesses that refused to pay protection money were burned down, and gang members who defied his orders often disappeared overnight. But external enemies weren't his only problem. As his empire grew, so did internal tensions. Running an organization of his size required absolute loyalty, but power breeds ambition. Some of his closest associates began questioning his leadership. They saw opportunities that he was unwilling to pursue, particularly as Prohibition approached. The illegal alcohol trade was set to explode into the most profitable criminal enterprise in American history, but he was hesitant to fully embrace it. He had built his fortune on gambling, prostitution, and extortion, and he saw no reason to shift his focus. This reluctance created fractures within his ranks. Younger, more aggressive figures believed he was too cautious, too set in his ways. They saw bootlegging as the future and believed that controlling the flow of alcohol in Chicago would bring in more money than any of his existing businesses. Some of his lieutenants began forging their own alliances, preparing for a future where he was no longer in charge. Meanwhile, law enforcement pressure was beginning to mount. While he had long enjoyed protection from corrupt officials, the political landscape was shifting. Reformers were pushing back against the deep-rooted corruption in Chicago, and federal authorities were starting to take notice of organized crime. The public was becoming more aware of how criminal syndicates operated, and newspaper reports often linked his name to illegal activities. Though no solid evidence ever led to his conviction, the increased scrutiny made it harder to conduct business as freely as before. Another major threat came from rival gangs that were growing in strength. The rise of the Italian-American mafia in Chicago, particularly a younger, more ruthless faction, signaled a new era of organized crime. These men were more violent, more aggressive, and they had no interest in following the old ways of doing business. They believed in absolute power and were willing to use extreme force to achieve it. One particular rival posed the greatest threat of all. A younger, more ambitious gangster had been watching from the sidelines, learning the rules of the underworld and waiting for the right moment to strike. Unlike him, this up-and-coming figure had no reservations about embracing Prohibition and was eager to dominate the alcohol trade. He had gathered a following of equally ruthless men, ready to take over Chicago's underworld by any means necessary. As tensions escalated, the city became a powder keg. Shootings and assassinations became more common as rival factions fought for control. The balance of power was shifting, and for the first time in years, his position at the top was no longer guaranteed. His old strategies of diplomacy and political influence were losing effectiveness in the face of this new breed of criminals who relied on brute force and modern firepower. The question was no longer whether he could maintain control, but how long he could survive in a world that was rapidly changing around him. The 1920s brought one of the biggest shifts in American history, the introduction of Prohibition. With the passing of the 18th Amendment, the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol were banned across the United States. But rather than eliminate drinking, Prohibition created a massive underground market for illegal liquor. Almost overnight, bootlegging became the most lucrative criminal enterprise in the country, and gangsters across America scrambled to take control of this new industry. For someone who had spent years dominating Chicago's underworld, this should have been an opportunity. Prohibition was a gold mine, and those who controlled the supply of alcohol would amass fortunes beyond anything gambling, prostitution, or extortion had ever provided. The demand for liquor didn't disappear, it skyrocketed. Secret bars known as speakeasies sprang up across the country, and ordinary citizens were willing to pay high prices for a drink. However, he was hesitant to fully embrace this new business. He had built his empire on vice, gambling houses, brothels, and protection rackets. These were industries he understood and controlled with precision. Bootlegging, on the other hand, was a different kind of operation. It required large-scale smuggling, coordination with suppliers, and constant evasion of federal authorities who were cracking down on illegal liquor trade. Unlike his traditional businesses, which operated under the protection of corrupt city officials, bootlegging was far more risky. The government had sent federal agents to shut down illegal alcohol operations, and these enforcers weren't as easy to bribe as local lawmen. He also believed that prohibition might not last long. Many in government and society were already questioning the practicality of banning alcohol, and he assumed that sooner or later, the law would be overturned. Rather than invest in an industry that might be short-lived, he chose to focus on his established businesses. But this decision proved to be a critical mistake. While he hesitated, younger, more ambitious criminals seized the opportunity. A new generation of gangsters saw the potential of the illegal liquor trade and moved quickly to establish their dominance. They built networks that smuggled alcohol from Canada and Mexico, bribed police officers to look the other way, and flooded Chicago with bootleg liquor. These men weren't just interested in making money. They wanted to take over the entire underworld, and they saw him as an obstacle in their path. His reluctance to engage in bootlegging made him appear outdated in the eyes of the rising criminal class. He had once been the most powerful figure in Chicago's underworld, but now he was viewed as someone unwilling to adapt to the changing times. His old allies began shifting their loyalties, and even those within his organization started questioning whether he was still fit to lead. As the demand for illegal alcohol grew, so did the violence. Prohibition sparked bloody wars between rival gangs fighting for control of the liquor trade. These new gangsters didn't operate under the same rules he had followed for years. They were more aggressive, more willing to use extreme violence, and had no respect for the old ways of doing business. Shootings, bombings, and assassinations became common as different factions vied for dominance. The political and law enforcement protection he had relied on for years also began to weaken. As prohibition intensified, federal authorities increased their efforts to dismantle organized crime. The same city officials and police officers who had once been on his payroll now had bigger concerns. Bootlegging operations brought in far more money than his traditional businesses, and bribery money was coming in from multiple criminal factions. This meant his influence was no longer as strong as it once had been. Even within his own organization, cracks were beginning to show. Many of his associates saw bootlegging as the future and grew frustrated with his unwillingness to get fully involved. Some even started working with rival gangs, seeing greater opportunities outside of his leadership. His refusal to adapt was making him vulnerable in a world that was rapidly changing. With the balance of power shifting in Chicago's criminal underworld, it was becoming clear that the rules of the game had changed. Prohibition had ushered in a new era, one where money flowed faster, violence escalated, and loyalty was constantly in question. For the first time in years, he was no longer in full control of his empire, and the forces gathering around him were preparing to challenge his rule. As the underworld of Chicago transformed under the weight of prohibition, tensions within his own organization began to rise. He had built his empire on a foundation of loyalty, but loyalty in the world of crime was often fleeting. The very men who had once sworn allegiance to him were now questioning his leadership. His reluctance to fully embrace the bootlegging business had created a dangerous divide, one that would soon threaten everything he had worked to build. For years, his power had been absolute. His lieutenants followed his orders without question, his enforcers kept his enemies in check, and his financial backers, whether corrupt politicians or business figures, ensured his operations ran smoothly. But with the rise of the illegal liquor trade, everything was shifting. The men who had once been content with gambling rackets and prostitution rings now saw an opportunity for something much bigger. Bootlegging was proving to be more profitable than anything they had ever imagined, and they weren't willing to let outdated leadership stand in their way. At first, the betrayals were subtle. Some of his men began making secret deals with rival bootleggers, supplying them with protection and manpower in exchange for a cut of the profits. Others started siphoning money from his businesses, using the funds to finance their own operations. What had once been a tightly controlled organization was now beginning to fracture, with different factions forming behind his back. The most dangerous threat came from within his inner circle. One of his closest associates, a man who had served him faithfully for years, had begun plotting against him. This lieutenant had watched as their rivals in the bootlegging business amassed wealth and power, while their own organization remained focused on outdated rackets. He believed that new leadership was needed, someone who was willing to seize the opportunities Prohibition had created. And if that meant removing the old boss, so be it. The power struggle was not immediate. His men still feared him, and his reputation alone was enough to keep most of them in line. But the cracks were becoming more visible. His orders were not always followed as quickly as they once were. Some of his top men began meeting in secret, discussing the future of the organization without him. The once unshakable foundation of his empire was beginning to erode. He sensed the growing discontent and took measures to reassert his authority. He demanded loyalty from his men, made examples of those suspected of disloyalty, and tried to remind everyone why he had been in power for so long. But these actions only fueled the resentment. The younger, more ambitious figures within his organization saw his reactions as signs of weakness. Instead of uniting the organization, his attempts to maintain control only deepened the divisions. Meanwhile, his enemies outside the organization saw an opportunity. Rival gangs had been waiting for a moment like this, a moment when his power was not absolute, when internal conflict weakened his grip on the city. They began making moves, encroaching on his territory, striking deals with those inside his own ranks who were eager to betray him. For years, he had ruled with a combination of intelligence, political influence, and calculated violence. But now his control was slipping. He was no longer just fighting outside enemies. He was battling ghosts within his own empire, men who had once been his allies but now saw him as an obstacle to their ambitions. With each passing day, the whispers of betrayal grew louder. His name, once spoken with fear and respect, was now being discussed in quiet meetings as a problem that needed to be solved. He had spent his entire life building a criminal empire, but the very men he had raised were now preparing to take it from him. And in the world of organized crime, power struggles rarely ended without bloodshed. As the cracks in his empire widened, the underworld of Chicago was shifting in ways that even he could no longer control. The rules that had once governed organized crime, the unspoken codes of respect, loyalty, and territory, were rapidly being replaced by a new breed of gangster, one that valued brute force over tradition. The old ways of doing business, which had sustained him for decades, were now being challenged by a younger, more ruthless generation. At the center of this shift was a growing power struggle. His hesitation to fully embrace bootlegging had left a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum, especially in the criminal underworld. Where he saw Prohibition as a temporary nuisance, others saw it as the future. The demand for illegal liquor was skyrocketing, and the men who were willing to take risks and use violence to control the supply were becoming the new kings of the underworld. These new players were not interested in diplomacy or political maneuvering the way he had been. He had built his empire through calculated alliances, working closely with corrupt officials, police officers, and businessmen to ensure that his operations ran smoothly. But the gangsters rising to power under Prohibition had no patience for such tactics. They understood that Chicago was no longer a city where backroom deals and political influence alone could maintain control. It was now a battleground, where power was measured in bullets and body counts. The younger factions, many of whom had once worked under him, began to carve out their own territories, often through open warfare. Drive-by shootings, bombings, and assassinations became daily occurrences as rival groups fought for control of the city's illegal liquor trade. This level of violence was something he had always tried to avoid. He had preferred to operate in the shadows, using fear and influence rather than outright war. But the new generation of gangsters had no interest in subtlety. The most significant of these rising figures was a man who had once been an ally, but was now emerging as a direct competitor. Unlike him, this new leader was willing to do whatever it took to dominate the illegal liquor industry. He was younger, more aggressive, and had no loyalty to the old guard. Where he had hesitated, this rising gangster moved quickly, forming alliances with the most violent enforcers and taking over key bootlegging routes. As this new order began to take shape, his old methods of maintaining control started to fail. The police officers and politicians who had once protected him were now being courted by his rivals, who had more money and fewer scruples about using violence to enforce their will. The balance of power was shifting, and for the first time in years, his name no longer carried the same weight in the streets of Chicago. Even the businesses that had once depended on him, gambling houses, brothels, and protection rackets, began to align with the new order. Owners of speakeasies and underground casinos realized that the future belonged to those who controlled the flow of alcohol, not those clinging to the past. Many of them started paying protection money to the newer gangs, seeing them as the true power in the city. This erosion of power was not just happening in the streets, but also within his own organization. The men who had once been his most trusted allies were now either defecting to his enemies or making their own moves to secure a future without him. Some of them still showed him respect to his face, but behind closed doors, they were already planning for a Chicago where he was no longer in charge. Despite everything, he refused to accept defeat. He had built this empire with his own hands, and he would not let it slip away without a fight. He still had allies, he still had money, and he still had the reputation of a man who had ruled the underworld for years. But the walls were closing in, and the city he once controlled was now being reshaped by men who did not fear him the way others once had. Chicago was no longer the same place it had been when he first rose to power. The era of carefully orchestrated corruption was fading, replaced by an era of relentless violence and high-stakes criminal enterprise. He had always been a survivor, adapting to the changing tides of the underworld, but this time, the change was happening too fast. And in the ruthless world of organized crime, those who failed to evolve were often left behind or eliminated. As the tides of power continued to shift in Chicago's criminal underworld, the walls around him grew tighter. He was once the undisputed ruler of vice in the city, a man whose name carried weight in the streets and whose influence reached the highest levels of politics and law enforcement. But now, that power was slipping from his grasp. The forces working against him, both external enemies and internal betrayers, were becoming too strong to ignore. The final days of his reign were approaching, and for the first time, he could feel it. The city he had once controlled was no longer the same. The rise of Prohibition had brought new players into the game, ruthless men who cared little for the old ways of doing business. Where he had built his empire through careful political maneuvering and backroom deals, these new gangsters ruled through bloodshed and intimidation. He had spent years maintaining order in Chicago's underworld, ensuring that conflicts were settled through negotiations rather than open warfare. But now, those rules were being cast aside. His enemies were no longer hiding in the shadows. The younger factions, emboldened by the money and power that bootlegging had brought them, were making aggressive moves against him. They were taking over his businesses, luring away his men, and striking deals with corrupt officials who had once been on his payroll. He had built his empire on vice, gambling, prostitution, extortion, but the new order had its sights set on something even bigger. Bootlegging had become the most lucrative criminal enterprise in America, and his reluctance to embrace it had left him vulnerable. Even within his own ranks, the whispers of discontent were growing louder. His lieutenants, men he had trusted for years, were now questioning his leadership. They saw him as outdated, too cautious, too unwilling to do what needed to be done to stay on top. Some of them had already begun shifting their loyalties, forming alliances with his rivals or preparing to strike out on their own. He had always ruled with a combination of fear and respect, but now, fear was fading, and respect was being replaced with ambition. The political protection he had long relied upon was also beginning to crumble. For years, he had operated under the protection of corrupt politicians, judges, and police officers who turned a blind eye to his activities in exchange for generous bribes. But as the bootlegging wars escalated, the government was coming under increasing pressure to crack down on organized crime. Federal agents were being sent to Chicago to dismantle the powerful criminal networks that had flourished under Prohibition. Suddenly, the politicians who had once been his allies were distancing themselves, unwilling to risk their own careers by being associated with him. He was not a man to surrender easily. Even as his grip on the city weakened, he refused to accept defeat. He still had resources, he still had men loyal to him, and he still had the reputation of a man who had ruled Chicago's underworld for years. But he was no longer operating from a position of strength. He was on the defensive, constantly looking over his shoulder, aware that danger lurked around every corner. He attempted to fight back, using the same tactics that had served him well in the past. He tried to broker deals, to negotiate with his rivals, to reassert his dominance through the sheer force of his presence.
But the city had changed.
The men now running the streets had no interest in deals or diplomacy. They saw him as an obstacle, a relic of a bygone era, and they had no patience for anything other than complete control. The streets of Chicago, once ruled by his iron grip, were now filled with uncertainty. Murders and bombings were becoming a daily occurrence as rival factions fought for control. The once organized structure of crime he had helped build was descending into chaos, and for the first time, he was no longer the man pulling the strings. As the betrayals mounted and the threats against him became more direct, he knew that his time was running out. He had spent his entire life building an empire, and now that empire was slipping away, piece by piece. He had always believed himself to be untouchable, a king of the underworld who could not be removed. But in the world of organized crime, there was no such thing as permanence. The final days of his reign were marked by paranoia and desperation. He moved cautiously, avoiding familiar places, knowing that his enemies were closing in. The men who had once sworn loyalty to him were now waiting for the right moment to strike. His name, once feared throughout Chicago, was now spoken in whispers as his enemies plotted his downfall. He had always known that power in the underworld was never guaranteed, that every kingpin eventually faced a challenge to his rule. But he had never imagined that his own downfall would come so soon, nor that it would be orchestrated by the very people he had once trusted. The empire he had built was crumbling, and he was running out of time. The city of Chicago was a pressure cooker, and he was at the center of it. The empire he had built over decades was unraveling before his eyes. The power he had once wielded effortlessly was now being challenged at every turn. He had spent years establishing himself as an untouchable force, a man whose name alone commanded respect and fear. But as the streets became more violent and the new generation of criminals grew bolder, he could no longer ignore the reality. His reign was being challenged, and the confrontation was inevitable. The warning signs had been there for months, if not years. The younger factions, fueled by the profits of bootlegging, were no longer content to operate under the old rules. They saw him as a relic of a past era, a man who had built his empire on vice, but had failed to evolve with the times. He had tried to maintain control through influence and negotiation, but these new players weren't interested in deals. They wanted power, and they were willing to kill for it. Whispers of a plot against him grew louder. He could feel it in the way his men spoke to him, in the way old allies hesitated before answering his calls. He was no longer the unchallenged ruler of Chicago's underworld. He was a target. His instincts, the same ones that had guided him to power in the first place, told him that a move against him was coming. It was only a matter of when and how. Despite the growing danger, he refused to back down. He still carried himself like the boss he had always been, appearing in public with the confidence of a man who is untouchable. He dined in the finest restaurants, dressed in his signature style, and carried on as though he was still in complete control. But beneath the surface, he was more cautious than ever. He traveled with a trusted group of bodyguards, kept his meetings brief, and avoided his usual routines. He knew that in the world of organized crime, predictability was a death sentence. His rivals, however, were patient. They had studied him, watched his movements, and waited for the perfect moment. They knew that despite his caution, he still had his habits, places he liked to go, people he liked to meet. And they knew that when the time was right, they would strike. He tried to rally what was left of his loyalists, but even they seemed unsure. Some of his closest men had already defected, aligning themselves with the rising powers of the underworld. Others remained loyal, but their numbers were dwindling. Fear had begun to take hold, fear that standing beside him meant sharing his fate. The streets were more dangerous than ever. Chicago had become a battlefield, with bombings, assassinations, and drive-by shootings happening almost daily. The gangs fighting for dominance showed no mercy, and alliances shifted like sand in the wind. It was a different world from the one he had once controlled, and even he could feel it slipping away. Rumors spread quickly that a confrontation was coming. Some said he would make a final stand, refusing to be pushed aside by the younger generation. Others believed he was looking for a way out, an escape before it was too late. But those closest to him knew the truth. He was too proud to run, too stubborn to surrender, and too set in his ways to change. The city buzzed with speculation about how it would happen. Would it be a public spectacle, a dramatic assassination in the middle of a crowded street? Would he disappear quietly, his body found days later in some back alley? A message from his enemies carved into his flesh? Or would he go out in a blaze of gunfire, refusing to let them take him without a fight? One thing was certain. The confrontation could no longer be avoided. The men who had once feared him now saw him as a stepping stone to their own power. The city he had built his empire upon was no longer his. And as he moved through the familiar streets, he could feel the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. He had spent his life playing the game of power, manipulating, bribing, and eliminating his way to the top. But in the end, power in the criminal underworld was always temporary. No king ruled forever. The only question that remained was how his story would end. No man rules the underworld forever. No matter how powerful, feared, or influential he might be, time eventually catches up. In the end, the streets decide who remains and who falls, and the streets of Chicago were already rewriting his story. The final chapter of his life was unfolding, not in the way he had imagined, but in the way it always does for men like him, through betrayal, violence, and blood. He had once been the architect of his own empire, a man who understood the intricate balance of power, money, and fear. He had bribed politicians, bought police officers, and crushed his rivals with ruthless efficiency. For years, his system worked, but the world had changed, and he had refused to change with it. The younger, more brutal generation of gangsters had rewritten the rules, and he had been left behind. The power he had once wielded with absolute confidence was now slipping from his grasp. The respect that had once kept his enemies in check had turned into whispers of his downfall. The same men who had once bowed to him were now plotting his demise, looking for the perfect moment to erase him from the streets. And in Chicago, once your power faded, there was only one way your story could end. The betrayal came as it always does, sudden, brutal, and final. He had always known that trust was a dangerous thing in the world he lived in. He had seen it happen to others before him, men who had grown too comfortable in their power, too blind to the shifting tides. But even he had not expected it to happen so quickly, nor from those he had once considered loyal. The moment came when he least expected it. Perhaps he had let his guard down, believing that his reputation still held enough weight to protect him. Perhaps he had ignored the warning signs, thinking that even in his weakened state, no one would dare make a move against him. But the truth was, his enemies had been waiting for this moment for a long time. They had studied him, planned their strike carefully, and when the opportunity arose, they seized it without hesitation. It happened in a place he had considered safe. A familiar setting, a routine visit, something so mundane that he had not seen the danger coming until it was too late. He had always been cautious, always aware of his surroundings, but in the end, none of it mattered. His enemies had outmaneuvered him, just as he had outmaneuvered others in the past. The attack was swift and merciless. There were no negotiations, no last-minute deals, no second chances. His enemies knew that leaving him alive meant risking retaliation, and in their world, unfinished business was unacceptable. They came prepared, ensuring that when they struck, there would be no mistakes. The moment of reckoning was not just the end of a man, it was the end of an era. His name, once spoken with fear, would now be whispered in past tense. The empire he had built would be divided among his rivals. The wealth he had accumulated would be seized by those who had orchestrated his fall, and the city he had once controlled would move on without him. But while his life ended in betrayal and violence, his story would not be forgotten. His rise to power, his rule over Chicago, and his ultimate downfall would be remembered as a lesson in the fleeting nature of dominance in the criminal underworld. His enemies might have erased him from the streets, but they could not erase the legend he had become. And as the city carried on, as new gangsters rose to take his place, his legacy remained, written not in ink, but in blood.